Hi, everyone, and finally, welcome to the next installment of the Rune Radio. I have here with me Kim from Morrigan and the Muted Crown on Substack. And Kim is here with me today because, I invited her because on the last topic of the Ministry of Psychic Weather, the cliffhanger topic, we really didn't get into it a lot. And rather than devote an entire episode of that to that in the ministry, we just decided to keep it for the Rune Shack Radio instead, so we can really talk about it instead of just superficially bounce a few. Superficially, not saying that the ministry is superficial, but instead of keeping the topic discussed superficially, we can really have an in-depth talk about it. And that's why Kim is here with me, because Kim writes extremely well-written, well-researched articles on her Substack, recommended very much. And you are somebody that knows a lot about this subject and can talk in depth about this subject. And I can't wait to hear your opinions about all of this. But please, maybe start off with, how did you come to write about all of this, or what triggered your interest in this subject?
I actually started out as a Christian. I grew up in a Christian home. And, you know, I'm one of those people, I need to know what I believe. It needs to make sense. It's not one of those things, well, you just have to believe. And then when you get to heaven, you can understand the mysteries of God. And I that just simply did not work for me. So I wanted to figure out the mysteries of God in during my actual life so that I knew what I was believing was correct. And I think what makes my research unique is that I was researching to confirm what I believed because I was a very devoted Christian. I wasn't just going to church on Christmas and Easter. It was every Sunday. It was Bible study twice a week. And so I kept coming into these, problematic to say the least, very confusing aspects of the Bible and the whole Abrahamic belief system. And I couldn't get any answers. And so I just started reading myself. I started dissecting the Bible. And I started noticing that there were a lot of characters in there that they seemed very ambiguous, but they played very big roles. And so I wanted to see who these characters were. And that became basically the rabbit hole that I've never gotten out of. So I ended up reading the Canaanite texts, like the Rosh Amrash, Babylonian, Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, Hittite, Nag Hammadi, Gnostic texts. I just began reading, and I haven't stopped. I've been reading for 25 years, just about daily. So I don't have any. I'm not formal academia, but I read constantly, and I did so solely out of just being curious. And that led me to ultimately start publishing some of what I've found because um, when you're not looking at history for a savior, but for facts and information, it reads much differently.
Yeah, I've heard a joke about that recently that actually read very true. If you read the Bible, the Quran, and the Torah as confessions rather than religious texts, they make a whole lot more sense. And
No, they
that
certainly
stuck
do.
with me. um,
They certainly do. And it's a very dark origin to them.
Speaking of those ambiguous
I surely
figures,
found out.
oh, yeah, we'll get into that. But first,
Oh,
about those
yes.
ambiguous figures that you mentioned, can you name a few? So, like those one or two
Well,
that just really stuck out to you.
well, I think what stuck out to me first, beyond any one figure, was that Yahweh seemed to be quite paranoid. Um, that he seemed to be very concerned about people worshiping false gods. Um, which just didn't make sense because he's God and he made everything. So why are there false gods? It just seemed very silly to me. And so I started researching who these false gods were. And I found them in the Canaanite pantheon. And a lot of people try to make it a very simplistic approach that, well, Yahweh and Baal, they're the same God. And my approach was different in that I found Yahweh, the God, the term Yahweh and Baal to be titles. And so it isn't even one singular deity. And so that's where it starts getting complicated. And so then from there I started looking at the New Testament, and especially like the book of Revelation. He's quite concerned about Revelation 7, a great prostitute. I've written about her in depth, and we'll discuss her a little bit today. The four horsemen of the apocalypse, like people have dissected that and kind of decoded it through the Greek, but they've never done it through the oldest pantheons that we have. And so I did that. And what I found is that we can find these gods in the ancient Sumerian, but they're not Sumerian. It's Babylonian, and I found them. And so when people think that these are just mythological horsemen, no, they're deities. They're that hidden pantheon in the Bible. So, for example, there's one named Nergal, and he is a god of war, plague, and death. There is a god Ningashita or Ningazita. It's kind of hard to pronounce them. And he is also a god of war, plague, and death. And he is the one that sword. And so you can go through and you can decode it. And when you do, it reads more like a horror novel than prophecy.
It certainly does, because I mean there are plenty of texts in the Bible where human sacrifice is actually a real thing and described in depth, not even in unsimilar ways as human sacrifices were made to the legendary Minotaur. Virgins were sent in.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's just, I mean, that's not to say that they are the same thing at all, but there are some similarities there that we're going to touch upon later as well when we get to the little St. James part, because there is a correlation there that I found.
Yeah.
But about the origin of Yahweh, from my research, and feel free to contradict me at any time, this is just, I don't know, I'm not as well researched in it as you, is that he was originally, or at least at some point early on, the son of El, who was the supreme god of the Canaanites, if I'm not mistaken. And that he sort of got absorbed into the Yahweh.
And yes, and that's exactly what we see throughout. And so people stop at the Canaanite, which is valid, because they're closer in proximity and time. But I went back further and I started to find the earliest origins of Yahweh. And what I found, and in fact, I have a few notes here. We have two texts, and it's pretty easy to go to like the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation event, and see that this god Marduk essentially takes the tablets of destiny from a woman. Sorry, I have hair in my eye. From a goddess, Tiamat, and then he absconds with them to the mountains, and he starts writing decrees and becomes the highest ranking god of the region. And so people will equate Marduk to Yahweh. And I've written about that extensively as well. But that kind of in a nutshell, you've got the same thing. He starts giving decrees from the mountains, and he starts ushering in his chosen people, and they are now taking over the region essentially. Mm-hmm. But Marduk is not the first. There is a text that predates Marduk and the Enuma Elish by at minimum 200 years, but I would argue further, kind of the, well, I wouldn't even say the consensus, but that is the possible earliest lapse in time between the two texts. And it is the text of Anzu. Now, Anzu is a very interesting character because he is a demon. He is classified as a demon, right, but he's not a demon associated with the underworld demons. He is a completely separate entity. And he is also known as the South Wind, which will really come into play later in this. So that's a very important detail to remember. And so he starts out as Zu. His name is simply Zu, Z-U. And then he transforms into a bird, which, I mean, it's not really a bird, I don't think, but in the text, he basically is the winged Zu. So he becomes the Anzu. And that's when he becomes, because On is heaven, Zu is wisdom. So he becomes the wisdom of heaven once he takes the tablets of destiny. But we can look back into the earlier records of him. And from Zu, we find the Papazu demon. This is the oldest demon recorded in Mesopotamia. It is the origin of Yahweh. The stories are identical. The stories of the difference between, and I wrote it down. So in the text of Anzu, he is the south wind, and he makes a plan to steal the tablets of destiny. Now, what those are, that could probably be a whole different show. But he steals them. He retreats to the mountain, but ultimately he is not successful. A hero god is able to take the tablets back. And this is very condensed. But then we get to the Enuma Elish. It is the same story, but when the tablets of destiny are stolen, it comes after the goddess Tiamat, the water goddess, and also the goddess of the underworld, because she has a river which is called Huber, which is the river, the great river of the underworld. And he kills her, supposedly, and then takes the tablets of destiny, and then becomes the highest ranking god of Babylon.
Right.
And so all of these are analogous with the Bible. The Bible has just stripped Tiamat completely out of it, sort of, because she is kind of in there in code words, but you have to know what you're looking at. But she is in there a little bit.
And Tiamat is a dragon, right? Is described as a dragon.
Well, she is described as a dragon, but that is later in the text. The earliest versions of her name is not Tiamat. No. Her name is Nama, Namma. And she is the cosmic and subterranean waters. And she is wisdom, and she is the goddess that created all the gods and all the goddesses. And she isn't associated with God in this. She was just like the first asexual reproduction. There isn't much about her, but that is what we do know. And then later, when the older Babylonian, and we have to understand, a lot of these texts that they call Babylonian, they were in Nineveh. And so if we look at the earliest Babylonian texts, those would be, I believe, the like Telemarna period. Those would still be thousands of years before any of these events happened. And so the earliest texts are still, there is quite a gap of time. And then between the earliest texts and much later revisions, which are the Nineveh, basically the later Nineveh revisions of these texts, which are popular and which most people cite, that is when Tiamat becomes a dragon. She is depicted as either a dragon or a monstrous woman with serpents for legs. But prior to these older Nineveh texts, she is not, there's no depictions of her as a dragon or a monster at all.
Right. Well, I can see the serpents for legs being translated to dragons, or at least there being a sort of reptilian connection, if not fish-like, almost. Melusine,
Yes. Well, and if you
is she the same? Melusine is a Greek figure.
I
two snakes or dragons, four legs.
So how I explain this is they're not, to say that they are the same. There's no way to know if they're, but what I can say with confidence is that they are of the same bloodline. And the reason that I say that is a lot of times, like, these titles are being passed down through these bloodlines, the epithets go with them. So you'll even see like Asherah, the Canaanite god, I don't know, or goddess. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She's in the Bible, but they turned her into a pole and a tree. But her epithet is she who walks on the water. She is the goddess of the water, which interestingly, that epithet is found in the book of John when Jesus walks on the water.
Right.
And so what I propose is that they have basically turned all of these different groups of gods and goddesses into biblical passages. And over time, that is how subjugation essentially occurred, is because they were basically creating these little touchstones of memory. So if there is this Jesus figure who is associated with these cosmic water and chthonic water deities, he would essentially have ill-gained legitimacy. Does that make sense? So people in that region that were devoted and loyal to these deities, later on, they're basically, it would be like an echo brought forward into the future to give legitimacy. And now it's not needed, but back then it was.
Right.
If that, I don't know if that even, it's something, it's hard to explain. It's kind of like, think of it like this. You see a lot of the cartoons that we grew up with as children, My Little Pony, Strawberry Shortcake, and things like that. And they're revamping them and putting them out again for children now because we have a tie to that. We feel nostalgic to that. So we're going to bring it forward, as where maybe without that nostalgia, those cartoons wouldn't gain the popularity. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so they're basically creating these deities through past nostalgia. But that nostalgia has long since diminished, now. We don't need Jesus being associated to water now. We did back then.
Right. To summarize a little bit to something that you said in the beginning, so they're basically titles, or let's just call them titles that are passed down to generations. I'm going to go on a limb here, but that still continues to this day, as you just described with the cartoons. if there are titles, then there are actual real flesh and blood people connected to that, which of course harkens back, like people are the spiritual people are the spiritual children of their prospective gods. The same thing is said about Odin, for instance, that he was an actual human at some point, it got deified. Now, two completely separate belief systems, but there is a commonality there in that sense that we are indeed the spiritual offspring of our gods. Now,
sure. Well,
the Norwegian royal house claims descendancy from Wotan or Odin, or at least in some obscure corners. Mm-hmm. Now, who would be these descendants of those gods here today? Who would those people be? Any guesses?
Well, first we have to figure out who these gods are. See, I think one of the more clever tricks of this Abrahamic cult is the longevity and how it has disguised itself. When we hear the term, like today, talk about the Anunnaki a lot, and that they're aliens, and that they came to Earth to mine gold for their atmosphere, and all sorts of crazy stories that you can find nowhere in the texts. This is fiction. It's absolute fiction. And in fact, the Anunnaki, they don't exist. It's 3 different bloodlines. And this is important to answer your question. We have 2 original bloodlines. They are the Anuna and then the Ki. The Ki were water-based, and the Anuna were chthonic-based, so underground. But they were not always underground. This is later, well, I won't even go into that. They weren't always underground. But these are 2 separate bloodlines, royal family bloodlines, not aliens, probably human. And they got married. There was a merger in this family, and they became the Anunnaki. So the men from the Anuna married into the Ki women, and there was a merger. But there is a third. See, the Anuna and the Ki, we don't know. Well, I think I do know where they're from. I think they are way further up north. There was a third lineage, and it's called the Igigi. The Igigi are where this Papazu demon originates. They are from the Levant, and their highest god was Zu, Anzu, Papazu, Marduk. This is all the same. It's just with different titles, like you saw how like Zu becomes Anzu when he has wings, because now he's up in the heavens, in the sky. And so Zu becomes Anzu, but it's the same figure. And so what happened in the Enuma Elish is the Igigis were inserted into the Anunnaki lineage as children and descendants. But no other texts support this. There was a mother and a father of Marduk inserted into these texts that you can find nowhere else. And it is quite clear if you read the text in their entirety that there was clearly a war going on between these bloodlines. Otherwise, Marduk killed his grandmother Tiamat.
Right.
He didn't kill his grandmother. He was not related to her. And so that is the basis for saying that there is a hidden war, and it's not even so hidden right now. It's very out in the open right now with the current events going on in the world. But the Igigi lineage are who I would consider the Epstein class today.
Right.
I do think that they are descendants. Can I prove that? Not, no, but I think in the totality of the evidence of what they do, the way they collect artifacts, their behaviors, I think I think the case is pretty compelling. You know, we just don't have the actual genealogy to prove it.
That would be a very difficult thing to do in the first place, because any DNA that might have survived those times is going to be very degraded. There's no way to, even if we had it, it would be very difficult. Now, one question, the three bloodlines. So you had the Anuna, you had the Ki, and you had the Igigi.
Mhm.
I am assuming that the war was between the Igigi, and the two other ones, because
Yes.
since they married with each other, must mean that they had to form an alliance of sorts against a third
Yes.
faction. What is the origin of this war, or why did that happen?
Um, we can only speculate as to why, because we do not know.
Hmm.
The reality is the Igigis, they have they have essentially had control of history and how history is written, you know, like going back to what I was saying in the beginning, that people think that they are reading Sumerian texts. They are not. They are reading Babylonian depictions of these ancient primordial Sumerian gods and goddesses. And but everything is running through the chain of custody of Marduk. And he had a son named Nabu, who was his sage, the one that basically dictated how history was going to be written. And so there is unfortunately a lot that is lost. But what I can say is going back to Tiamat, because you like heard that name and associated her with a dragon. Um, and most people do. And because that's what the evidence is now. If you look at the much later depictions of her. But if you actually look at the Babylonian dragons, like the ones on the gate of Ishtar,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
they look like cows. They look like skinny cows. If you look at them, they're kind of like a hybrid of a cow and a dragon. They don't look like dragons.
No,
Um,
they're very bizarre looking
they're very
creatures.
bizarre looking. They look kind of like skinny cows.
Mhm.
And my and because how do I put this? It's hard. There's so many details. It's like you have to go down so many layers. But the oldest versions of a goddess that we can find is associated with a cow. And this we can find up in the ancient ruins of Kukateni, like the Russian steppes or steppe, however people want to pronounce that. That's where we can find, and again, there isn't a lot, but we can find this cow iconography coming from that area. And you know, you look at which book is it? I'll think of it in a second. In the Bible, there's the king of the north, and I believe it's the book of Daniel, maybe chapter 40:11 or 11:40, maybe. But in the book of Daniel, it talks about the king of the north as an adversary. And so can we prove this? No, but I think that there's a lot of reason to suspect that these bloodlines, the Anuna and the Ki, actually came from the north, more up in the Russia area.
And those are the ones that are associated with the cow specifically.
Mm-hmm. Cow, water, and they became, and I should, because a lot of people, this is one of the things that people are like, oh my gosh, they're demons because they're deities of the underworld. they are deities of the underworld, but they weren't originally. And so when Marduk, whether he killed Tiamat, which I don't think he did, and we could get into that later, but whenever he took over that region, he imprisoned a lot of these Anunnaki bloodlines underground. They were in, it was called Eridu, and Babylon was built on top of it. Babylon, the Babel, that originally was called God's Gate. And Marduk, one of his basically translations of his name, because K and G can be interchangeable, he was the God who contained. He became the container of the gods, and he assumed 50 of their identities. 50. And so they did become associated with the underground because they were essentially imprisoned down there.
Right. Well, this can easily be translated to politics in a very broad sense, because one is imprisoned and he takes on their titles, and a title comes with a function. So he takes over their functions and their title, because whoever had them previously is now redundant because they've been imprisoned, but it's still associated with something that needs to be performed in the real world, which he will take upon himself then. And about the cow specifically, and this is a bit of a leap, but Poseidon is a god that is typically associated with the sea. So the sea people, in fact, sea people often worshipped him. Now, a very, very common sacrifice to him was a bull, so a male cow. And that is something that comes back in a lot of Greek sacrifices. Actually, human sacrifice really wasn't so common, but animal sacrifice was. And bulls and cows were very, very preferred animals to sacrifice. Is there any relation to that? Why specifically the cow is such a popular sacrifice? Is this symbolic, as in saying, like, you're associated with this animal, I'm humiliating you further by killing the animal that is associated with you?
Yes, that is my opinion, is that it is essentially a mockery. And if we look at Marduk, it's very interesting that his name, because they all have all of these Marduk names, titles, they come with epithets attached to them. After he killed Tiamat, he took on I shouldn't use that term. After he did away with her, too late now. His name transitioned to, he shall keep Tiamat subdued and her life cut short. Why would he need to do that after the fact? And after this occurred, he started a festival. It was a New Year's festival, and I've written about this a lot too, called the Akitu Festival. And in this Akitu Festival, it is essentially a humiliation ritual. And it is one that they have to go through this reenactment process of taking her out again and again and again. They have to take her out. There's all chaos, it's basically like a anarchy, chaos purge that's going on, and they have to do this reenactment of taking her out, and then they symbolize it through it's graphic, but cutting a dove in half, because that was one of her, that's an iconography of that bloodline as well. That's why you see the dove in the Bible. They would cut a dove in half, and then on the 10th day, there would be a sacred marriage ceremony. But it didn't seem very consensual. And in fact, the Babylonian women, according to Herodotus, I believe, they would have to, once in their life, volunteer to be, oh, what's the word that I could use that would be sense, that would be more, they would have to offer themselves up in perverse ways during this festival. And then a sacred marriage would occur between Marduk and his queen that he chose, who is oh, her name, how do you pronounce it? Ser Serpenitu, I believe. Serpenitu. And it is very interesting because there isn't much known about her. But one detail that I find very interesting is that her sanctuary, see, she didn't have her own ziggurat or anything like that. But she had a sanctuary. Let me see. I think I wrote it down. She had a sanctuary that was, oh, here it is. No, this isn't it. Sorry. It was basically the sanctuary of the mysteries of the underground. And I'm not saying that verbatim, but there is an actual link to her being from the underground. And so I do find that very interesting because you see that this character, Yahweh or Marduk, he has to constantly be doing these ceremonial rituals to keep Tiamat contained and subdued. And then there's usually a water or a underground goddess associated with it. And then they, of course, they have the sacrifices of the cows and things like that that you see all throughout history.
Even today, still in certain Abrahamic beliefs.
Oh, yes. Yes, the red heifer. Yes. Yeah. Didn't always used to be a cow.
No. That is very interesting. Well, the cow in general has, I mean, apart from its gender, has a lot of female attributes. Just in its whole symbology, really. I'm going to take another leap here. You said before that it's basically a god or a demon originally, specifically a demon, described as a demon in its origins, of a mountain.
Yes.
If that's correct, right? I remember that correctly. A demon of the wind and
yes,
a mountain.
He was the.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Because
yeah, he was. And the way I see it is, I don't think that there's anything. I think that we can apply a more practical meaning for a lot of these things. And one of them being that the mountain, with life and rivers being in higher elevation, that is going to be more supportive of life than a dry, barren desert. And so I think a lot of that is more just about the geographical location. But he did seize the mountain, and he is a demon. He's called the the Osku demon in numerous texts. And as Papazu, he is defined specifically as a demon.
Right.
So, and in poems, Zu is described as a demon as well.
Okay. Well, this is here's where I'm going to take my leap, because this is an actual argument I was having with Grok AI over the depiction of Yahweh as being a dragon, which is contested, I will admit that, but the argument was this. So he is Lord of the Mountain, which Grok admitted, yes, it's Lord of the Mountain, God of the mountain, quote unquote, of the wind. There is smoke coming from his nostrils and fire on his breath. Now, obviously,
Mhm.
what is the thing that immediately comes to mind is a dragon. And the
Right.
argument then progressed, saying like, okay, but then describe Leviathan to me, who plenty of people would say is Tiamat in well, it's not the same. Well, we'll get back to that. But that wasn't the point what I was making. What I was saying is like describe Leviathan to me, and you describe him the exact same way. It is a creature that lives underground, that can fly, that lives in the water specifically, and there
Yeah.
is smoke from his nose and fire on his breath. So like, okay, so they're both dragons. And Grog
Hmm.
was very, very adamant that I had that wrong, that just because they are described in the same manner doesn't mean they are the same thing. And that's where I ended the conversation, because that kind of sounds like don't believe your lying eyes.
Yes. Yes. Well, and it's interesting because in the there's a Sumerian text called the Seven Conquered Enlils. And the Seven Conquered Enlils, this is how you see the progression of Yahweh. And so to say that Yahweh and Leviathan are one and the same, it's correct and it's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
So you have, because you have different Yahwehs. So, for example, in the book of Job, you're looking at a Yahweh who is Zu, who is Papazu or Marduk, also known as Alalu. He has numerous names. It's very complicated. But then you start going down the line because he doesn't stay Yahweh. You know, you can see like at places that there are transitions in title that it's just very subtle words that you can start to see, oh, he changes, he acts different after this point. Because it's not one deity, it is a title and it is changing. And so the Leviathan, at one point, he wasn't the Yahweh, then he was the Yahweh,
Mm.
then he wasn't the
Okay.
Yahweh. And so
Okay. I gotcha.
it's, does that make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah, yeah, it does.
Yeah,
That actually
yeah.
reminds me of one Bible scholar who I've actually found interesting because he had a very interesting take on it all. And he read the Bible and said,
Mm,
I'm going to take everything as literal as I can. So there's no mythology, there is no supernaturalisms going on, nothing. And he came to the conclusion that if he read the Bible that way, he came to the exact same conclusion as you, that God is basically a title. Yahweh is a title, and specifically a title for an army general. So somebody who would deal in conquest. That's
yes,
very, very
yes.
interesting.
He, he's a, he's a warrior. He's a warrior god. He is a war god. And nobody would be worshiping him if he didn't write himself into the story as a god instead of a demon.
Mm.
That's why you have the different texts. You have the Anzu text, and they had to rewrite it. It's like, oh, this isn't going to work. People don't like this character,
Right.
so we're going to make him the mighty Marduk, son of um, a water goddess and um, a Nuna god.
Mm.
But there's no record of them anywhere else. And this isn't just my opinion. I mean, many Sumerian academia will say there's no record of them anywhere else except for in this text. And if you take that out, and if you look at Marduk as an Agigi, which he is, they're a completely different bloodline. They are not related. He's not related to Anu. He is not related to, well, and those are all titles as well, but he's not related to any of the original older gods. Where he comes from, again, the Levant. But other than that, I don't know.
Well, this is going to be close to my to the end point of part one, but there is obviously a vested interest in keeping that alive today. So it is still relevant in many, many ways, which we're going to get into at part 2, because that's also going to be a
Well,
little bit more. Yeah.
Let me say this before we switch into part 2. People wonder how these transitions and titles and these bloodlines occur and how they continue into modern day. If you can make the case that they continue into modern day. If we go back to one of the other oldest texts, the Atrahasis, we can see the gods, and this is it is clear as day what is happening. They are performing ceremonies with birth goddesses, where on a certain day of the celestial cycles, and the moon, they will extinguish one of the old gods, and his ghost will go into a new body supplied from a birth goddess. That sounds like controlled reincarnation to me.
It does. I was about to say it. That touches upon so many niche internet conspiracy theories, which is extremely fascinating. I wish we could get into all of them, but that's going to be a time constraint. If you ever want to pick that up on another podcast, you're always welcome to, because I find it fascinating.
Okay. Well, it'll tie in the second half.
Right. About the second half, I'm going to close it here for part 1, because we are getting into the more graphic and a bit more gruesome and YouTube sensitive topics here. So I'm going to keep that for Substack, because some words are going to trigger automatic demonetization and even suppression of the video. So best to keep it for another platform. Kim, tell people where they can find your work.
You can find me on Substack at Morrigan and the Muted Crown. And that's, I don't have my work anywhere else, as I was never planning on publishing or doing anything with it. But for now, that's where you can find me.
I will definitely link you in the comments and also on my own Substack. Definitely check it out if you want to get more in depth about the mythology that we just talked about. And I know this might seem like a long prelude to the cliffhanger topic from the ministry, but trust me, it's relevant, and that will become very clear in the second half. And speaking of, we will see you both at the second half. And thank you very much for being here with us and for taking the time out of your day to listen to both of us converse about this most fascinating subject.